and it's preparing live stream right now.
And I can see that too.
Great, 6 people liked our live stream before it started. Or at least that's what my end. Oh,
That's a lot of confidence in us.
It's interesting. It looks like I started it, but it does not show it on my phone screen.
Yeah, I opened up the YouTube link. Try and spotlight John's video. Here, I'll do that now.
Oh, you did it. Okay. Yeah, it looks like we're live. Also, let me start broadcasting it here or not. Are we ready?
Is that for the public?
Yes. Not yet?
No, not yet. Let's wait till it's almost 6 o'clock. So we don't, you know, we don't have the candidates in yet. And
It's interesting. It says this live event will start in a few minutes, in a few moments. But
Yep, that makes sense.
Oh, because it's scheduled to 5:50.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, great. Okay.
Hopefully they come on in.
yeah, Derek, because once we start the Zoom meeting, we're just going to, you know, everyone who comes in is just going to be looking at us, and let's do it. And, you know, I'll say welcome and we'll get started in a minute. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So in a minute or two, I will let you know that I'm about to start it, so you can.
It's 5:50, right? Yeah, like 3 minutes, 2 minutes before, and then we'll start right at 6.
Are you guys
Sounds
in
good.
direct contact with William and Bridget?
Yeah, they should know. I'm looking at my email.
One of them just joined. William.
Oh, hi, Mr. Cunningham. Okay.
Hello,
Hi, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Great, welcome.
I'm gonna mute myself.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, did we want to do some audio and video checks before we go live? Maybe everyone can just unmute themselves and turn on their video.
Sure, if everyone can unmute themselves and turn on the video, just make sure we all can see you all. And you all can hear me, right?
Yes, John, thanks.
Can you hear me? Are we good to go?
Yes.
Great.
Is Bridget still on here?
Looks like it.
In the room, just not speaking. Oh, connecting to audio.
Okay.
John, did you turn on the lights? Everything?
Yes, my lights are on.
Great, that's what I saw. Just looks good. Okay. Great. This is more.
All right. Wonder if Bridget needs some assistance.
I'm looking at my email. There's nothing there.
Okay, Bridget just left.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lisa. Um,
Hey, John, did you get that updated intro I sent you?
So,
It's a Will Cunningham. Did you get the updated intro I sent you yesterday?
my intro.
The moderator is introducing each candidate, right?
Yes.
I sent you an updated intro yesterday.
I have it basically, the intros, I have to make them each equal, but almost everything you have is in.
All right, thank you.
John, YouTube stream started, so I'm starting broadcast right now. It's 5:59.
Okay, I hope Bridget will come back in. I think we need to wait for her. She was here.
Well, right. We're on YouTube, so it makes sense to
Okay.
broadcast it officially. Okay.
There we go.
Hi, Bridget, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Perfect. How you doing, John?
good. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
And I'll mention to you and Mr. Cunningham that we are going to ask you to mute yourselves while, and then unmute yourself when it's your turn to speak.
Absolutely.
We can do it from our control person. We can mute everyone if necessary, but if it'd be easier and less time.
Sure, no problem.
So,
Yeah, I don't mind doing that.
yeah, you're muted while everyone else is talking. And I think we're ready to go. Good evening. I'm John Frungen, Executive Director of the William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy. We're at Stockton University, well, I am, and we're having this remote. And the Hughes Center is sponsoring tonight's 2nd District Democratic primary debate. This will be a 1-hour debate. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer questions posed by me in a randomly determined order. If a candidate criticizes another participant during their response, that candidate will get a 30-second rebuttal. A timekeeper, Alyssa Maurice of the Hughes Center, will signal when 15 seconds remain for a response, and there will be a slight chime. I will politely interrupt if necessary. So now let me introduce the candidates. Will Cunningham was born and raised in Vineland, New Jersey. He overcame childhood poverty and homelessness to attend Brown University, graduating in 2007. Mr. Cunningham is a former Teach for America teacher in low-income schools and was class president of the University of Texas School of Law, class of 2012. For the past 6 years, he has worked on Capitol Hill as chief investigative counsel to the House Oversight Committee, chaired by the late Elijah Cummings. Dr. Bridget Callahan Harrison, a South Jersey native and resident, is a proud graduate of Stockton University, and she attended Rutgers University for her master's and Temple for her PhD. She has taught political science and law at Montclair State University for the past 2 decades. She is the author of one of the leading textbooks on American democracy used in colleges across the country. And Dr. Harris offers her insights on politics and government frequently in New Jersey and national media outlets. Amy Kennedy is Education Director for the Kennedy Forum, where she works for policy change in education and mental health. She has more than a decade of experience working in New Jersey public schools, and Ms. Kennedy advocates for mental and emotional wellness for children and adolescents through participation on multiple boards. An Atlantic City native, She grew up in Pleasantville and Absecon and lives in southern New Jersey with her husband, former Congressman Patrick J. Kennedy, and their 5 children. Welcome all. Thank you for being here. And now the first question, in a order randomly determined, will go to Ms. Harrison. The recent killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis has sparked not only a mass protest movement, but a long overdue examination of a range of social justice issues. My first of 2 questions on this topic is about law enforcement actions and culture. What reforms to police departments and criminal justice do you think are needed?
Thank you, John. First off, let me thank you for hosting this event and the Hughes Center and Stockton as well. So this is an important question, and it is perhaps the only issue that could have driven COVID off of our front headlines. I am proud to have been endorsed by Senator Cory Booker, who is a co-author and co-sponsor of the Justice in Policing Act. And this is a beginning of a much needed series of reforms that is going to essentially make sure that law enforcement is held accountable, not on the municipal or state level, but on the federal level. We need to first off eliminate chokeholds. We need to make sure that police are trained and undergo psychological testing when they are hired. We need to establish a national database so that police officers who commit these egregious acts aren't allowed to travel from one municipality to another to another. There have been a series of municipal reforms that I would say that we need to go even further. These include things like making sure that psychological testing is ongoing so that we can, which happened in the city of Baltimore after Freddie Gray's death. We can also make sure that police officers are policing each other so that if they witness something, even if it's committed by a superior, that they have the power and the authority within a hierarchy to call that person out. I think that this is a really important issue moving forward. The most important thing is that while we can't legislate a change in behaviors, we can't legislate a change in mindset overnight. What the civil rights movement has taught us is that we know that by making these actions illegal, we can then make acting on those thoughts illegal.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy, your response.
Also, just thank you so much for hosting. And I just think that this is really a moment for us to not only take action for the Justice for Policing Act, but to really evaluate the systematic injustice that we see in our country. And so it will, of course, need to be addressed in our criminal justice system and in policing behavior. I was as appalled as many of you watching by the murder of George Floyd and the murders that we've seen time and again throughout our country. But we know that it will need to be a comprehensive change that we see in this country that will impact how policing is done, but also how we are discriminating in every system throughout the nation. I have the example of Pastor Francois, who is in Pleasantville, and he is a well-known pastor who just earned his doctorate, spoke at a vigil that I attended for George Floyd. And in that, he talked about how even though he's accomplished and he's done these great things and he's a faith leader in our community, people don't know that if they see him on the street and he's not treated with the respect that he deserves. And that's something that we're going to have to address in many ways, but from birth, the way that we're looking at our systems of healthcare, the way that we're looking at education, as well as in the criminal justice system when we talk about policing and their behaviors, and when we address mental health for our police officers, when we look at how we spend funding, whether or not we're investing in the community as a whole and in their wellness and in their safety, or just on the policing end.
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham, please.
Thank you for having us all tonight. This issue isn't theoretical for me, it's deeply personal. And now is the moment for action. Make no mistake about it. You know, I've gone to rallies and spoken at protests, and I've grieved and mourned with this community as we've walked through the streets. I've seen one of our own thrown to the ground because she thought Black Lives Matter and she wanted to do something about it in Ocean County. That's what's happening here in South Jersey. But we have to meet this moment with bold policies. There are things we can do, and we know we can do them to really address this issue. We absolutely must end qualified immunity. There is absolutely, we have to hold the police accountable when they commit crimes, period. Secondly, we absolutely must have transparency. When we talk about transparency, what I mean, we need to know what's happening in our law enforcement facilities. We need to know what those misconducts and what those complaints are. You know, let's look at George Floyd. The murderer of George Floyd had 17 complaints against him for misconduct. It just came out this past week that Eric Gardner's murderer had 7 misconduct complaints. In any other job, this would be intolerable. It would be unacceptable, and it must be intolerable and unacceptable in the police field. Now, banning chokehold, banning lynching, that is just the start. We have to meet this moment. We have to have a more equitable and fair country. And it starts with us being bold about how we deal with this current crisis. And this candidacy is going to be bold in all of our policies because this is a moment and we must seize it. Thank you.
Thank you. I will ask each of the candidates to please pay attention when the 15-second icon pops up. Try to keep it to 90. Thank you. All right, so we're going to start with Ms. Kennedy on this follow-up question. The reaction to the George Floyd killing has forced many Americans to confront issues of racism, economic inequality, and white privilege. These are huge, complex issues, of course. But how do you advocate that we at least start trying to address these problems?
Thank you. I think you're right. I think this is a very complex issue, and I was very anxious to get faith leaders together, NAACP leaders together, and to have this conversation with my campaign and be able to make sure that I'm listening to those voices, because I think the place to start is with the community and making sure that I am doing the listening so that as I am moving toward legislation and trying to develop policy, that it is amplifying voices in the community and not just putting forward what I think would be best. But that it's going to be important, we know, to not only do more education around this issue. We know that that's happening already. People are talking, they're sharing, but we're also going to have to make sure it's embedded in our curriculum when we start with young people, because that's where change must begin, that it is part of an expansion in our curriculum, but then we're moving into how we use that lens when we're looking at housing and equity and employment, as well as in all of our other systems. I'm sorry, John, is the 15 seconds just popping up? Okay, thank you. I was a little, sorry, wasn't sure.
Go ahead.
I think it'll start early, and that we're going to have to address it in each system. So for me, that means not only addressing the police brutality, but that we are taking that and making sure that that it starts with me, and that I'm looking at how I'm raising my own children and addressing my own bias. It'll be, I think, a work in progress, and that the legislative actions have to happen to change our behaviors.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cunningham, would you give us 90 seconds?
Absolutely. You know, there are so many legislative policies that we must enact. We absolutely have to take action now to address these inequities and these inequalities that have persisted for so long. My 13-year-old body was thrown on the ground and I was handcuffed at the age of 13. So when we talk about knowing what that feels like and knowing what it feels like to be seen as a threat, even at that age, that is an existence for an entire community of people in this country and our district. And when we talk about privilege, that is a privilege that folks that don't look like me have. And we have to be real, and that's what has to drive the urgency for the reforms. Now, we can talk about justice reforms, but there are other avenues of justice. Economic justice. Let's talk about the fact that 50% of Black people make under $15 an hour. Almost 60% of Latinos make under $15 an hour. We know we invest in our own communities. Some of these issues will solve themselves, but we haven't been pushing as hard as we should. And you know what? As congressman, it's going to be a priority of mine. Why? Because I know what it feels like to be in a home where you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Yes, I'm an Ivy Leaguer, but my mom makes $12 an hour, and I do not have to look very far to see that people in South Jersey continue to struggle. I'm going to fight for those folks. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, John. So, what Will says with regard to economic justice is right on. I think that one way that we start in this realm, and I hope that it will be a topic for later in the evening, is that we talk about legalizing adult use cannabis, because that is one of the inequities that is perpetuated in our system that disproportionately affects Black and brown people. But I also wanted to call attention to another reality that we have to deal with, and that is, we are all familiar with the name of George Floyd. We are not as familiar with the name of Derek Coley. Derek Coley was a 29-year-old man who was in prison in Arkansas in Lincoln County. And Derek Coley died recently. He had an 8-year-old daughter. I bring Derek Coley to your attention because the reason, or part of the reason that Derek died and the circumstances under which he died have to do with a company called WellPath. And WellPath is a for-profit healthcare company that operates in for-profit prisons. It is part of the inequity of our system of the school to prison pipeline that is victimizing Black and brown men. And I will ask for Amy to answer why she has accepted $11,000 in campaign contributions from this company known for its corrupt pay-to-play policies that victimize Black and brown people, including people in for-profit prisons and ICE detention centers. We can mourn George Floyd, but we also have to mourn Derek Coley. And I would ask Amy why she took that money, why her husband serves on that board, when it is clearly a corrupt organization.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy, would you like to respond?
Yep, thank you. Yeah, I think this is a persistent attack that Bridget's made of my campaign, and yet she's refused to take the pledge to not take corporate PAC money. So while she wants to criticize individual contributions that I have to my campaign, we have thousands that we've been able to gain support throughout this country and throughout South Jersey. She herself still is willing to take money from corporations and then criticize my family's work in mental health. So in our efforts to try to improve mental health care in this country, she will continue her attacks time and again without moving forward with her own campaign and show that she's willing not to be influenced by corporations.
Thank you. I don't want to go back and forth all night, but Ms. Harrison, your name was mentioned. Would you like a brief response?
Absolutely. Unlike Amy, I haven't accepted $1 in corporate PACs, and I certainly haven't accepted $1 from any entity that makes their money off the most vulnerable people in society.
All right, let's move on. We have a lot of important issues here tonight. And this one, we're going to start with Mr. Cunningham. Americans have sacrificed greatly as we fight the coronavirus pandemic. More than 120,000 have lost their lives. How would you rate our country's response to the pandemic? What more, if anything, can be done? Especially, is there anything Congress should be doing more? Mr. Cunningham.
Absolutely. President Trump has failed. The grade is an F. I'm a former teacher, and this is the easiest paper I've ever graded. F. Governor Murphy, he didn't endorse me, but I give him an A because he did the right thing. He made sure that our state took this seriously from the get-go. And that's what we're seeing the ramifications of in other states right now. So they didn't take it seriously, and they're surging and they're spiking. While New Jersey, we're going to be on our shore this summer because we did the right thing and we quarantined. Now, this goes to a larger issue because Trump absolutely has to not be president in 2021. But when we talk about holding this president accountable, we need folks who know how to do this job on day one. And the fact remains, I have 6 years of experience on Capitol Hill, and none of the three candidates in front of you right now have ever held elected office. So that means my relevant experience is that much more prominent, that much more important, that much more vital and essential to making sure that we get results for this district. Now, when we talk about this pandemic, what we just were allowed to have, we had a trial run of how our country can respond to severe pandemics and how we deal with this in our government. And we have to use this as a lesson, as a case study at how we can better respond when we know things are coming. And climate change has to be one of those things. We just had a trial run and we must use it to address the climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harrison, what about our pandemic response?
So I like Will, I give the president, this administration, an F. I don't know if you or anybody watching realizes this, but my own husband nearly died from COVID. And so he was in the intensive care unit for 2 weeks. They were amongst the most frightening 2 weeks of my life, a feeling of utter helplessness. When you can't see your loved one, you can't go and fluff a pillow. The doctors and frontline workers at the hospital were commendable in providing me with information, but that information was oftentimes, there's not a whole lot we can do. Paul was incredibly lucky that he received a plasma donation from somebody who had recovered and is doing well. But it really brought home to me during that period. I was absolutely furious, not just with President Trump, but with Jeff Van Drew. And I'll tell you why. I watched as Congress member after Congress member through New Jersey secured FEMA testing sites in their districts. And here in South Jersey, in Atlantic County, we were in quarantine, under the governor's orders from March 15th forward. You couldn't get tested in Atlantic County until April 9th. I mean, that is extraordinary. And this is a person in Jeff Van Drew who allegedly can pick up the phone and have his buddy Donald Trump, at the other end of the line. Why did we not have a FEMA testing site? I think moving forward, we need to make sure that we are securing the resources that we can protect our constituents, because it's clear that South Jersey is getting the short end of the stick.
Thank you. We're all glad about Paul's recovery.
Thanks, John.
Ms. Kennedy, 90 seconds on our pandemic response.
Yeah, this is a place where we all agree that Trump has failed our country. He sent mixed messages from day one about this virus. He has used it to have racist epithets and to really target people during this time and use it as a cover for a lot of other policies that we don't agree with. So again, what we're seeing with the visas, the way that he has undermined access to important care, we're seeing it time and again, and we are in desperate need of real representation here that Jeff Van Drew has not provided. We are in still a really important time in this virus where we're seeing the uptick in many states around the country. We're fortunate to have had the leadership of Governor Murphy, which I think has really played an important part in the lives of South Jersey in particular and keeping us safe. And I am grateful to have his endorsement. But I think that what we need to see from Congress is an extension of the loans, which we know people are really struggling during this time, and that it's not going away anytime soon. So we're going to have to see an increase in testing and tracing. We need to see support for the CDC. We have to make sure that he is not left to make these decisions, because I think that is a death sentence for many.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, this question will start with Ms. Harrison. President Trump and the Republicans are in court suing to overturn the Affordable Care Act. On the other side, some Democrats call for Medicare for all. Where do you stand? what do you support in healthcare policy?
So, I mean, the fact that you have this war going on the most vulnerable, let me tell you, I come at this, I don't want to take all the time, but my first husband, Ken, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. He worked at Stockton. We had great health insurance. In the last year of Ken's life, my out-of-pocket healthcare cost exceeded $80,000 a year. And I personally was faced with financial ruin. I was able to dig myself out of it. I believe that healthcare is a universal human right. And I think that we must make sure that everyone has health insurance and has access to equal healthcare. I support a single payer system that allows people to keep their private insurance and sunsets the ability, particularly when we look at corporations and organized labor unions that have negotiated part of their compensation as being healthcare benefits, that they are enabled to negotiate cost of living increases when the government takes over the provision of healthcare. But no one should be in the circumstances that they're faced with the choice between getting treatment, getting tested, getting access to healthcare, and whether they pay their rent, their mortgage, or put food on the table.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Yeah, I think that this is the wrong time to be attacking the Affordable Care Act, that so many right at this moment are in desperate need, and that we need to move away from a system that ties health insurance to employment, because we know that at this moment, with unemployment skyrocketing, that people are in a crisis, and that this is an opportunity with coronavirus to make sure that we are giving treatment to all who need it, and make sure that we can do that and provide free vaccinations when they become available, and that we're still able to push forward an expansion of the Affordable Care Act and make sure that Medicare will be available to all who want it. I believe that we should be committed to this. I think that America is looking to move this forward, that we as a country cannot leave a vulnerable population uninsured. And I will fight to lower prescription drug prices and to make sure that all Americans can have access to affordable health care.
Great, thank you. Mr. Cunningham, your take on healthcare.
We absolutely need to have Medicare for all, period. And I am ashamed that my opponents aren't there where they should be on this issue. Medicare for all, we see so many, what ails this country, Medicare for all is actually the answer. We saw in the pandemic that there was Black people died at 3 times the rate of white people. Access to care is an issue. Racial health disparities have always existed, and we have to meet this moment with bold systemic policies, because if you don't, you're starting a negotiation from a weak point, and we cannot have a weak congressperson in this seat. Now, when we talk about how we get there, the legislation already exists. I worked on it. I worked with Senator Sanders' office to introduce several prongs when I was looking for Chairman Elijah Cummings, Medicare negotiation, drug importation. We would save the country tens of billions of dollars by enacting these prongs of Medicare for all. And this will all be a phased-in program. This won't change overnight. But if you're not there, I do have to question why, especially if you talk about healthcare premiums, endangering your family financially, you talk about mental health, and you have a policy that actually goes to the heart of those issues, and you don't support it, that I just don't understand. But we know the American people are with us. Overwhelmingly, Americans want Medicare negotiation. They want the Health and Human Services Secretary to actually negotiate down the prices of prescription drugs. Look up the Kaiser polls. We know this to be true. We know pharmaceutical companies are taking advantage of our country because they give, I monitor drug pricing for a living on Capitol Hill. We know we're being taken advantage of. So we have to be bold about solving this issue, and I will do just that.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we're going to start on this question with Ms. Kennedy. And this question was suggested by a resident of Egg Harbor Township. What would you do to bring more economic opportunity and relief to the people of South Jersey, especially with so many currently experiencing hard times.
Yeah, this is, I think, part of, before I decided to get in this campaign, a lot of the conversations I had, even with my own family. My brother works at ShopRite and my sister-in-law works for Atlantic Care. We've all lived in this area for our whole lives. And my great-grandparents used to own businesses in Atlantic City. But as parents, we've kind of talked to each other and said, what will our kids have an opportunity to do if they stay in South Jersey? And we know that that's the question facing a lot of families right now. And that means that we need to do more to make sure that there will be opportunity that goes beyond the casino industry, although we know that's an important piece of our tourism industry. It's going to have to mean an investment in infrastructure. It will be not just roads and bridges, but also things like internet access that we've seen be so crucial during this time of the coronavirus, that students are really struggling. It will also mean that we try to think creatively about how we can expand the research park at the FAA, because we know drone testing is becoming more advanced throughout the country, that we're doing that we're looking at the airports that we have in our district, at how we could use those more effectively as not just a place to take off for a destination, but also maybe as a hub for places that are assembling parts for things. That we're also looking at how we can invest in green technology and green energy, as the governor just proposed the wind port in Salem County. And we know offshore wind off of Atlantic City is going to be a big piece of that. But we have to have prepared residents that will be able to afford to live here. So the economic answer is also going to be affordable childcare, a raise in minimum wage, and looking at other things to help families. Sure. Sorry.
Mr. Cunningham, economic relief for South Jersey.
Yeah, economic relief is desperately needed here in South Jersey, and we must have a multifaceted approach that meets communities where they are. I already discussed how vitally needed a higher minimum wages, especially the brown and black families, who majority of workers are making under $15 an hour. But we need to go further. We need free community college. We need to be investing in our communities, because when we invest in our communities, we see a return on that investment. Now, we know free community college, and I helped introduce this legislation with Senator Booker. We know it would save social services $50 billion a year, because community college graduates are less dependent on social service needs. They have better life outcomes. So why are we paying on the back end what we should be investing on the front end to make sure our communities are taken care of and have access to opportunity? But for me, education was the conduit that changed my life. I went from homeless to working in the House of Representatives. That happened because there are opportunities for me right here in South Jersey, and we need those opportunities to exist for everyone else that lives here. Now, when I talk about a multifaceted approach, I also mean we have to be innovative. Right now, we have a chance to reopen this economy in an innovative way, with new industries, with new approaches that bring and include everyone. This is about economic inclusivity, and we need all communities to be represented as we uplift these communities economically. That means we need a Green New Deal. We need to be investing in green infrastructure, and we need to be investing in green new jobs. I'm so happy to hear that Salem plant is happening with wind farming, but we need to make sure our communities are reflected. The communities of South Jersey across races and economic backgrounds deserve those union jobs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, John. So this is really one of the things that drove me to this race, because, you know, I grew up here, I've worked here, and I can recall, particularly when I was greeting buses at the Tropicana Hotel Casino, going to Stockton, you know, time after time after time, we've seen this proposal to reinvigorate Atlantic City. And it seems to me that we've tried to structure a regional economy around a 3-month industry. And what we need is to diversify our economy. And how I see that happening if I'm fortunate enough to serve as the Congresswoman from New Jersey's 2nd Congressional District, my first ask of Speaker Pelosi would be a seat on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And with that, it is my strong hope that we will be able to get 66 miles of rail line connecting Atlantic City to the rest of New Jersey Transit, so that people can get from here to Newark, to North Jersey, even to New York City, so that people can live in our communities and make them thrive. We have great schools, we have beautiful views, we have pinelands, oceans. This is such a desirable place to live. And you know, where I work, it's a thriving community, but people don't work there. They live there, they have great schools, but they work in other areas. And the reason that they can do that is in North Jersey, people have access to public transportation. Here, we have no access to North Jersey or New York City by rail. It's certainly feasible for people to commute that way. We also need to make sure that New Jersey Transit is funded by the federal government, that portion that comes from the feds, so that we can get from here to Philadelphia. We need to make sure that people who are living in Salem County and Cumberland County could even get to Wilmington, Delaware, if we had more than a 2-lane highway. And so I think that investment in our infrastructure is really highlighting how Jeff Van Drew has failed us in his tenure in Congress.
All right, so we've just crossed the midway point, and we're gonna put this question to start with Mr. Cunningham, and this was an issue several members of the public touched on. A Stockton University poll last fall found widespread concern all over New Jersey that climate change is already affecting the state. How much of a threat do you think climate change is, and specifically, what actions or policies do you support? Mr. Cunningham.
Thank you. Climate change is an existential crisis, and we must address it now. So much so, people may have thought it was odd for me to have a virtual town hall that talked about climate change in the middle of the pandemic, but it actually wasn't. Because some of this, there are so many striking parallels between the communities that were most vulnerable to COVID and the communities that will be most devastated with a climate crisis. Now we can, and we have, with the leadership of Governor Murphy, we flattened the COVID curve, but you can't flatten a climate change curve in 3 months. We're already behind schedule and we have to act. Now here in South Jersey, we've had some cautionary tales. We know Hurricane Sandy devastated entire communities. There's a Bay Shore community here in Cumberland County, and there's a book that I highly recommend by Andrew Lewis that we had a book club in my campaign, The Drowning of Money Island. It talks about what that looks like on a human level. People, these are communities that are lost, coastal communities, economies that can't come back. And if we don't address it on the Jersey Shore, we're doomed to repeat history. Now, there are some things we can do. The Army Corps of Engineers has already introduced a plan that we've seen. It came out in 2018, it's finalized in 2019. It will cost $10 billion, a comprehensive mitigation strategy to install bulkheads and levees and floodgates. These are things we have to invest in, because when we don't invest, we are wasting money. Since the 90s, New Jersey has spent $1 billion on beach restoration. This Army Corps of Engineers plan saves us $1.7 billion annually and pays for itself in 10 years. I will champion this in Congress.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Harrison.
Yeah, I mean, we live on the front lines here of the climate crisis. And, you know, I personally lost my house in Hurricane Sandy. So I felt it from a personal perspective, but I also see it from an economic perspective. You know, down the street on Ventnor Avenue, if there's a high tide and a full moon, lots of times restaurants are closed. And that means that those restaurants aren't serving patrons, that waitresses aren't making tips. It has a very real everyday impact on our economics. And we need to recognize the interconnectivity between climate change and our economy so that we can grow our economy in a sustainable way. The first part of this is that we, should I be in Congress, need to pressure presidential administrations, not just to agree to things like the Paris Climate Agreement, but codify that subsequent administrations can't leave those agreements, like happened with both the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris climate change. You know, the Green New Deal is something that has been talked about a great deal. One of the problems that I have with the Green New Deal is that it is not binding, and we need to have forceful congressional action that ensures that net zero greenhouse gas emissions are at 0 by 2050, and we need to start now. We can do this by increasing energy efficiency in buildings, in auto emissions, but I think that this is something that has to be codified and not something that we just kind of hope for the future.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy, 90 seconds on climate change.
Thank you. Yeah, it's something that, as both candidates already mentioned, is so personal to all of us, having lived through Sandy, but also knowing what's happening on the Delaware Bay and how that's going to impact part of this district as well. It's really important that we are talking about how we make it part of the curriculum. So I was excited to see that that got passed, that we are the first state in the country that moved toward having environmental education in our schools, K to 12. I have my master's in environmental education, and I believe that we need to make sure that we are committed as a country to 100% clean energy by 2050, and that we're doing what we can now to preserve not only the Pine Barrens and the Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer and the things that we have in our region, but that we're moving toward an industry, an economy here that focuses on green tourism, green energy, and building that out, because I think it will provide jobs and it will save our communities and keep them a viable place to live. In Brigantine, where I live, it has been such a change in our neighborhood and our community. Since Sandy, we have lost half the student population because so many people could not afford to rebuild or pay for flood insurance, and they've moved away. And that's what's happening across South Jersey. And I believe that we really need to be committed to making those changes.
Thank you. Our next question goes to Ms. Harrison to start. The term Infrastructure Week has become a joke in Washington because nothing ever gets done. Yet our roads and bridges continue to crumble. What do you see as the second district's most pressing infrastructure needs, and how would you address them?
I mean, boy, John, that's tough because there's so many of them. You know, what I see is two things. First off, I was lucky enough at the last summer to take a road trip down to Asheville, North Carolina. So I drove through some of those, what we call moocher states. And I saw that the roads there, you know, I'm driving on the New Jersey Turnpike. I get off an exit. There's a piece of shrapnel on the side of the highway, and I lose a tire. Down there, they have landscaping in their medians, like manicured landscaping. And they're, you know, these are federal highways. We clearly need to more aggressively advocate for South Jersey's infrastructure. It has been neglected not just during the Van Drew tenure, but also during Frank LoBiondo's tenure. So I don't know that I can select one thing, but the three things that I would highlight are increased funding for public transportation, which solves a lot of problems. If you're in Salem County, you may not be able to get to healthcare, or in Cumberland County, you may not be able to get to healthcare because there isn't access to buses. We need federal subsidies so that New Jersey Transit increases its expenditures in South Jersey, where we're not getting our fair share. We also need rail lines, but certainly those roads, boy, oh boy, you know, when you're losing tires, it's time for some real repairs.
Great, thank you. Ms. Kennedy, your take.
Yeah. You know, I think our investment in infrastructure will take many forms. We need to see it happen now. I think this will be a really important push that needs to be made following the virus as we try and get the economy back on its feet, that it will provide jobs by doing things like addressing our roads and bridges that have a D rating in New Jersey. We need to make sure that there's safety, because that frankly should be a concern of all of ours, but also to the earlier point about the Army Corps of Engineers being able to invest in some of the climate protection that's needed, and looking at our education system. We know that there's many schools that are in need of repair, that have mold, but also things like the internet service is part of infrastructure too. And we have to be providing those services now more than ever, when people will be working and learning from home. And I agree that transportation is a very important piece, and making sure that our buses are moving and that the lines are available regardless of where you live will be an important piece of our economy.
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham.
We have to address the infrastructure. It could be a great equalizer in our district. What I mean by that, we also have to reimagine it. You know, I went into the woods in Route 9 in Cape May County. Everyone in Cape May County knows in Rio Grande, there's a homeless population in the woods. I am formerly homeless. And when I discovered this community was back there, I made it a priority to go, and I sought permission because this is considered their home, and I made sure it was okay to visit. And then I went back there just to see how they were living. We need to reimagine infrastructure beyond bridges and roads. And New Jersey does rank among the bottom 5 in the country in the quality of our bridges and roads. So that has to be addressed, but we need to address homeless shelters. We have a staggering amount of homeless people, and we don't do enough for them. There aren't enough services. Let's build affordable housing for all. Let's make sure that if you build it, they will thrive. You know, if they build it, they will thrive. People will thrive. This is a great equalizer. And this is what I talk about. When I talk about being a progressive, it's really about looking at things in a bold way, reimagining things in a bold, new way. Because that's really how you're going to address the issues and get to the heart of things and really help people. Because if you aren't in politics to help people, then I don't know what to tell you. That's why I'm in this race, because those closest to the pain have to be closest to the power. And that means enacting impactful legislation that actually addresses people's issues. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Kennedy. President Trump has made restricting immigration his major policy thrust. How do you feel about current U.S. immigration policies, and what reforms would you support?
Yeah, I feel like they are inhumane. I feel like this president and his administration has done everything it can to target people at the border, to target immigrants, to encourage racism and hatred in this country. And for me, watching the family separations at the border was really difficult during the time when I had a young baby at the time. My youngest son, Marshall, was a newborn, and they were showing family separation. And because I understand the intersection of that trauma and how that impacts their brains, that development and that trauma will forever change those individuals who were already suffering. And we need to absolutely have a pathway to citizenship. We need more humane treatment, but we need an immigration policy that will address this, and a process that gets passed immediately. I'm proud that Joe Biden has committed to doing this on day one. I think it's essential. I'm grateful to have a DACA recipient working on my team, and she is as committed as I am to making sure that this is a conversation that we continue to have throughout this campaign. I look forward to standing behind our immigrants and making sure that they have what they need to thrive in this country.
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham, your turn.
It is time for comprehensive immigration reform. We have to have a pathway to citizenship. And I am so grateful that Supreme Court made the right decision last week and declared that dreamers' dreams can continue, granted those dreams. You know, almost 2 million children are now eligible for citizenship because of that decision. But when we talk about immigration, there's more than just a pathway to citizenship. There are people who are undocumented who are working here already. When we looked at the population of farm workers who were vulnerable and exposed throughout COVID here in South Jersey, when we talk about that there's an entire industry that, you know, nearly 3/4 of all farm workers are immigrants. And anywhere from 50 to 70% of those folks are being paid $10 an hour and are fearful of losing their job. So no, they're never going to unionize, and they're terrified of retribution. And so we have to do a better job of taking care of folks that are already here, especially because 11 million unauthorized immigrants are already currently living here. They're working and they're contributing to our country. They are paying taxes. And yet they weren't eligible for some of that aid and the stimulus packages, even though they've been paying into our country. So we have to be humane about this. We have to make sure that everyone who is here is receiving the equality enshrined in our Constitution. And I will be that person in Congress voicing that strongly.
Thank you. And Ms. Harrison, immigration.
Yeah, so I'm actually the mom of an immigrant. My middle child was adopted. And I saw firsthand the vitriol and the impact of President Trump's rhetoric on people who come from other countries when I was walking down the street with my daughter in Philadelphia. And an old woman turned, is approaching us and turned around and said to her, "Why don't you go back where you came from?" This was right after Trump had been elected. And fortunately, my daughter, it rolled right off of her. She just turned and looked at me and said, "New Jersey." But, I certainly favor comprehensive immigration reform that accentuates the valuable contributions that immigrants make to our economy, the innovation that they bring to the table, the fact that they are, yes, filling a workforce need because of our aging population. But I also think it's important, and Amy, I'm sorry, I have to call you out again for saying one thing but doing another. There are people dying in ICE detention centers because of WellPath, and you still have taken that money and not returned it. And these are real people that are living in ICE detention centers under this Trump administration that are dying in their own vomit. And I just don't understand it. I don't understand how you can accept that money. I don't understand how Patrick can sit on that board. And you can criticize me for not taking this pledge or that pledge or whatever. I haven't taken a dime of money from these sources, and it's abhorrent. No campaign is worth human life.
Ms. Kennedy, your response.
Yeah. Frankly, I think that your constant attack is a little disgusting, because Patrick's work in mental health has provided coverage for 46 million Americans, and it absolutely has to do with mental health. Because while I agree that there should not be ICE detention centers, I still believe that people there should receive treatment for mental health. And I believe that that is what we need to do for anyone who is facing the trauma of the system that we currently have in our country.
Google WellPath and mental health. Google it.
This question will start with Mr. Cunningham. Many Americans horrified by gun violence support at least some gun control measures, yet you would represent a largely rural district with many hunters and gun owners. What restrictions, if any, would you support on gun purchases or ownership?
Well, thank you. And I'm glad we can get back to the issues. As we have to address gun violence because lives are being taken. One of the things I take the greatest pride in 2018 when I ran against Chef Andrew, I didn't sit on the sidelines and wait for it to be politically convenient to run for this seat. I called him out in 2018, and I was endorsed by the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence for that effort, because Parkland happened in the middle of that campaign and it devastated our country and broke hearts around our country. But there are so many reforms that we need, and common sense reforms. And so the fact that we have a hunting population, and I'm all for, I have no issue with hunting and seasons for controlling pet populations or animal populations. I don't have an issue with that, but I do have an issue with the gun lobby. I do have an issue with the fact that they purchase politicians. I do have an issue with the fact that there are reforms that a huge majority of Americans agree on, have a consensus on, and we can't get them passed. 92% of Americans want universal background checks. 88% of Americans want to close the gun show loophole. 71% of Americans want to ban AR-15s. It is unspeakable how we have a consensus of this nature on these issues and we have no action. But we need folks who know what they're doing in DC to get things done. My 6 years on Capitol Hill, and most recently as chief counsel on the House Oversight Committee, we will get things done and we will pass legislation that saves lives. it has to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harrison.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's an interesting question, John, and I think that the way that you posed it is exactly the obstacle that we've faced. Jeff Van Drew has believed falsely that this district is NRA territory. And what we know from polling is that 73% of residents of the 2nd Congressional District favor universal background checks. That overwhelming majorities support common sense gun violence prevention measures like limiting the number of magazines, like taking people off who, you know, right now, if you're on the terrorist watch list, you can't fly, but you can in some states walk into a Walmart and buy a gun. That's absurd. And so, you know, I am proud to stand as in my professorial hat. I have worked with March for Our Lives, New Jersey. I am inspired by how young people have embraced the gun violence prevention movement, particularly after the Parkland shootings. I also am a member of Moms Demand Action, and this will be something that I will not be afraid to take on the NRA and the stranglehold that they have in corrupting elite DC politicians with their money. That has been the reason that we haven't had the common sense gun violence prevention measures that overwhelming majorities of Americans favor. And, you know, if you're not afraid of the NRA, then you can do the right thing. And I'm not afraid of the NRA.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy, gun control.
Thank you. Yeah, when I taught in Northfield Community School, we would spend time every month having kids hide in the corner, quickly shutting the blinds, putting out red and yellow placards, and doing all of these drills instead of, as a country, taking the steps that we need to make sure that this isn't what our kids are experiencing. And I think that lack of action is directly related to the NRA's influence. And that's why it was important for me to have the support of End Citizens United, because I think that's where you see the impact. But it's going to be an important piece of ending the deaths of despair that we're seeing throughout this country as well, because we know that suicide is on the rise in our country. We need to make sure that families have the ability to intervene if they know that someone is a threat to themselves or others, that we're closing these loopholes, and that we are making sure that we have expanded our background checks, and that there is going to be significant change. And the only way to do that is to get NRA lobbying out of this decision-making process. The Kennedy family has been the victims of gun violence, and we see that it is generational trauma, and that's impacting millions of families around this country. And it gets passed down, and they're still living with these deaths while we remain inactive on this issue.
Thank you. This hour went really quickly. We're almost out of time. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question. If you could try to make your answers brief, then we'll get to closing statements. If elected, how closely would you, oh, and this is for Ms. Harrison Stark. If elected, how closely would you adhere to the Democratic Party line in the House? Could you see yourself working with Republicans?
Of course. I think, you know, part of the intransigence or the blockage that we've seen, what's wrong with our country is that unlike when my friend Bill Hughes was in Congress, people reached across the aisle and came to a consensus. And, you know, people have criticized, you know, people for not being ideological purists, if you will. But I think it's imperative that, first off, that we recognize that not everyone shares the values that we share, and that I've spent a lifetime working hard and listening to people, listening to my colleagues, listening to and learning from my students. And sometimes the most important thing that we can do is listen and reach across the aisle. And sometimes that means that we make perhaps not all of the progress that we want, but we make incremental progress. But history is the sum of progress being made by people willing to talk to others. And I think it's imperative that we not dig in our heels, that we listen to the current concerns. And, you know, Cory Booker is a role model, an icon for me in this, in practicing civility, in practicing the kind of values that mean people hear listened to, that they understand that their viewpoints are being valued, and that we come to a common consensus and move forward. But absolutely, I can see myself doing that.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's going to be really important moving forward. I think that there are places where we will be able to find consensus. There are issues that affect every family in America. Obviously, you know, my focus has been on mental health and talking about that a lot already in this debate tonight, but that's an area where it affects 1 in 5 people in this country, and we can agree that it is not a partisan issue, and we'll be able to find consensus to move it forward. I think it's going to be important when we look at how we can expand science and research, and that we find ways to work together, but that in all of these efforts, that we don't lose our focus on social justice. Because while I want to represent all of South Jersey and make sure that I have their interests in mind, I think that you can't lose your values and your sense of why you were elected, and that there is a place for making those overtures and being able to work together, but not at the expense of what we know needs to be done for South Jersey.
Thank you. And wrapping up, Mr. Cunningham.
Of course, I absolutely would work across the aisle. The fact is, I already have. As a congressional investigator, I worked with Republicans to advance legislation while in the U.S. Senate and while in the House Oversight Committee. You know, those drug pricing investigations I discussed, Mr. Cummings was ranking member. That means we had to get bipartisan agreement on our most intense drug pricing investigations. That means I was constantly working with Republicans. But beyond that, you know, I was a teacher in Houston, Texas with Teach for America. I went to law school at the University of Texas School of Law in Austin, Texas. There is no better education to receive on how to talk to Republicans than spending 5 years in Texas. And I think I got a PhD in it. I know how to talk across the aisle. I know how to get the results across the aisle because I've been doing it since the moment I began my career in public service. And that's what we need. But while we must prioritize working across the aisle, while we can't be purists, we have to hold folks accountable. The GOP is in lockstep with President Trump right now, and that is a problem. But once they return to sanity, 2021, when this man is no longer president, yeah, we can certainly work with them. We're going to advance some amazing legislation once we have the toxicity that is Donald Trump out of the White House. This is the kind of change I've been fighting for my entire life because I grew up, I know hardship. And we need someone who understands that to be our advocate in Congress. And that's exactly that intensity that I'm going to bring to this seat each and every day as your congressman. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move to 1 minute closing statements now. And I just want to thank all of the candidates. I think people out in virtual land are applauding right now. I think this was a really good exploration of the issues. And I dare say that I think the late Ambassador Bill Hughes would have been proud of all of the candidates here. So we're going to go to closing statements, and Ms. Harrison, you go first.
Thank you, John. I want to just thank you all for watching, and John and Melissa and the Hughes Center for sponsoring this. John mentioned at the early part of this debate that I'm a Stockton alumni. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college. I've worked hard for every advantage that I've gained in life. I've worked over decades developing the knowledge that will be imperative in the House of Representatives. But I've also lived a life that includes dealing with terminal illness and being a caretaker, that includes raising 3 children, sometimes as a single parent, that also includes seeing my second husband face COVID and looking at the economic realities that my friends and neighbors are facing in that aftermath. I challenged Jeff Van Drew, and I did that because I saw what my community needed. I may not have done it in 2018 like when Will did, but when I did it, Jeff Van Drew ran and took cover. He ran to the Republican Party, and the reason that he did that is he knew that he couldn't beat me. And so I don't have a famous last name. I don't have a husband that can plunk $500,000 into a super PAC, but I have worked hard my entire life, and I will work even harder in the House of Representatives to represent South Jersey honorably, with integrity, well, and I ask for your vote now because you can mail in your ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thanks. I grew up in South Jersey, and this is my home. I spent 14 years teaching in Northfield and began focusing on mental health because I saw that was what my students were struggling with. And I knew that if we were able to provide that lifeline to our students, it would also be a way to reach their families who might be struggling. But I think if this moment hasn't changed our focus and really crystallized what's important, it should, because coronavirus and the death of George Floyd and the movement that we are seeing across this country has to be turned into action. And I want to be part of that. And I believe that we can make a real difference if you have a representative that understands the needs of South Jersey, who lives here. I'm raising my family here, and I understand what we're seeing around us and the struggles that are facing everybody in South Jersey right now, from the economic hardships to the environmental changes that we're seeing. We need someone who's willing to work, and I think the work is just beginning. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Cunningham.
Thank you all for listening tonight. In this race, we have a choice. We can enable the political machines of privilege and power, or we can dismantle them for a just, fair, and equitable future. White millionaire congresspeople have always represented Black and brown communities here. They just can't understand the struggle. Remember this, the creation of change is not a sprint of outrage. The race for true equality has always been a marathon of persistence, a marathon started by my ancestors who fled slavery, determined to be free. They started this race generations ago. And now, in this race, the baton has been handed to you, the voters. Are you courageous enough to take it so we can keep running? If Black lives matter, then Black representation must matter. If you believe in forward progress, don't step back when you vote. Together, we can do this. I've known pain, I've lived hurt, and I will be our voice of transformative possibility in Congress. Let's do this together. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all the candidates again. I want to thank everyone who tuned in. If you want to learn more about the Hughes Center, please visit us at stockton.edu/Hughes Center. Please remember to vote and be safe and healthy. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night, John.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.